Hey everyone, I'd like to try something new here on the channel. I'd like to share with you an interview that I conducted with Dr. Bart Ehrman. Dr. Ehrman is a scholar of early Christianity and the New Testament. He's a professor at UNC Chapel Hill, and he's also a prolific author. He's written a bunch of books on Second Temple Judaism, the New Testament, Christian origins, and in fact, it was his recent book, Heaven and Hell, A History of the Afterlife, that inspired me to make my Origins of Satan video. So I'm excited to share this conversation with you. Let me know if you'd like to see more long-form content like this. I'm more than happy to do more interviews if it's something you'd like to see. But with that, here's Dr. Bart Ehrman. So I just wanted to start with your most recent book, Heaven and Hell, A History of the Afterlife. So this is a topic I'm fascinated with. I'm particularly fascinated with the origins of hell as a concept. So I just want to dive right into it. Did Jesus preach about hell?
As a first century Jew, Jesus didn't believe that your soul went somewhere when your body died. Jews believed that the body and soul were an integrated unit, and that the soul didn't live on, after death, and that's what makes a living person. And so it's kind of like what we think about the breath, right? We think that like when you're breathing, that's when you're alive, and roughly speaking, and when you die, your breath doesn't go somewhere.
Right,
And
right.
that's what the spirit was for ancient Jews. And so he certainly didn't believe that there was a punishment for souls after death.
Yeah. So when you're using that term breath, are you specifically referring to this Greek term pneuma, or is it even, I guess Jesus was preaching in Aramaic, so this
Yeah,
might be
well,
a different concept.
ruach in Hebrew,
Okay.
but the idea it's like in the book of Genesis. The way I try to explain it to people, it's in the book of Genesis when God makes Adam, right? He makes this lump of dirt, and it's in a humanoid form, but it's just dirt. But then
Hmm.
he breathes into it, and the breath is what makes him alive. And that breath in both Hebrew and Greek, the word for breath also means spirit.
Hmm.
And so the spirit isn't like this entity that pre-existed or that exists afterwards. It's the thing that animates the body. And when the body is no longer animated, it doesn't go anywhere. It's just dead. And so so for most Jews, when people die, they died. What Jesus believed, though, was what other apocalyptic Jews in his day thought, which was that there was going to be a life after death. But the life after death comes when the breath comes back into the body, or the spirit comes back into the body. And that allows the body to be animated again. And Jesus and other apocalyptic thinkers at the time maintained that at the end of the age, God was going to make right everything that had been wrong, and he's going to raise everybody from the dead. The people who were schmucks who got away with it are going to be punished. They're going to realize they really blew it, and then they're going to be subject to a second death, a kind of a torturous death by fire. And then the people who are on the side of God, who maybe suffered during life and weren't rewarded in life, they're going to be rewarded forever, but it'll be in the body. So Jesus believed that there would be life on earth for humans who are raised from the dead. They're not going to go to heaven. It'll be a kingdom here on earth, and those who were opposed to God would be ruthlessly destroyed,
Hmm.
but they're not going to be tortured forever.
Okay.
They're subject to a second death.
Yeah. So it wasn't so much like this disembodied. So even when we think about heaven and like the modern Christian concept is kind of this disembodied, separate reality, but you're saying it's like this very earthly concept in Second Temple Judaism.
That's right. There were a lot of Jews who were like this. We call them apocalyptic Jews. They're Jews who had this kind of point of view. Not everybody did, but a lot of people did, including the people who wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls,
Hmm.
the Essenes, and Pharisees had this view, and John the Baptist had this view, and so is a view that was widely spread that Jesus
Yeah,
shared.
and I did want to try to dig into the other texts because obviously we have the Gospels to work with, we have Paul to work with, but what are some of these other sources that you're referencing? You're saying other apocalyptic Jews. So do we have discussions about hell, an eternal torture of some sort, or what does resurrection look like in the Dead Sea Scrolls or First Enoch, if at all?
Yeah. So, all of these, of course, all of these texts are different. I mean, so that it's not that there's like one view about anything in Judaism.
Of course, yeah.
Get a few Jews together and start asking them things. It's like, oh my God, no. But and it's like that with these texts. It's like you get apocalyptic text, you get apocalyptic text. So they all have different views. Interestingly, resurrection does appear in the book of Daniel, our first canonical apocalyptic text that actually talks about a resurrection of the dead, the righteous and the unrighteous. First Enoch is an apocalyptic text, and it does have a sense that there's going to be a judgment day, but it's a more complicated text. It's got a whole different thing going on about, but there will be rewards and punishments in First Enoch. And interestingly, the Dead Sea Scrolls certainly are apocalyptic in their orientation, but resurrection itself as a theme isn't the big theme in the so. But the thing that's fairly consistent, with some exceptions, because all things are different, is that until people in Israel, until Jews were actually influenced by Hellenistic thinking, by Platonic thought and other kind of philosophical things that were coming out of Greece, they basically didn't think that the soul existed outside of the body. That idea was popularized by Plato. He didn't invent it, but it was popularized by Plato, that the soul and the body were two distinct things. And so there's kind of a dualistic understanding of the human, and that so the soul exists apart from the body. It can exist before the body. It will exist after the body. It's immortal. So the body dies and the soul lives on. And so the interesting irony is that the Christian view of a soul going to heaven and hell is a kind of a combination of what Jesus was saying about rewards and punishment after death for those who follow God, and the Platonic view of that the soul is going to live on forever. Those two are meshed together into what became the standard Christian view.
Yeah, so we've been hanging out in the first century here. So what happens immediately after? Because I seem to remember, I believe it's the Acts of Peter maybe that has this very visceral depiction of torture of some sort. Do we see a development of the concept of hell with immediately into the second century?
Yeah, so it's the Apocalypse of Peter, and it's a very interesting text because it's our first Christian account of somebody being given a guided tour of heaven and hell. And so Peter is shown around he's shown the places by Jesus, and the one reason it's interesting, it was written in the early second century, and one of the reasons it's interesting is because the description of heaven is very brief and somewhat banal. There's not much to say about people enjoying eternal bliss. I mean, it's great. But he goes into considerable detail about the gory torments of those in hell. And he lists a whole bunch of sins. And people are punished according to their characteristic sins in rather gruesome ways forever. And so the question is, how do you get from this apocalyptic view of Jesus and other Jews at this time to this view that the soul goes to one place or the other? And it's kind of a complicated story, but what I argue in my book is that the Apostle Paul, was influential in that, because Paul started out with Jesus' view that you can't separate the body and the soul. And Paul really believed the resurrection was coming very soon, the resurrection of the dead. I mean, he's very insistent. Bodies are going to be raised from the dead, and that's how you're going to be rewarded if you're a follower of Jesus. But the problem was, as time went on, Paul, who thought this was going to happen very soon, realized it wasn't going to happen soon enough because he might well die before it happens. And it just made him think, he thought, I've got this relationship with Christ, and I have this close, intimate, relationship. And am I going to die and then lose out on it until the resurrection? That doesn't seem right. And he started thinking that somehow he'll be in the presence of Christ when he dies. And once he thinks that, then you start getting the idea that, you start getting Paul, of course, who's raised in Greek circles, is starting to adopt the kind of this Greek way. Well, maybe I'll exist for a while before. He still thinks it's going to come soon, but he's not going to miss out on those 2 months or whatever it is, or 2 years before it happens. And so once he starts saying that, then Christians, most of the Christians at this point are not Jews, they're Greeks, they're Gentiles. And they latch right onto that. But then the idea is that if your soul goes up, if you actually are with Christ until this end comes, if you're on Christ's side, what happens well, that means that the soul lives on. Well, what about the people who aren't with Christ? And so then you start developing the idea that, well, there will be rewards and punishments after death. And that's what latches on, rather than the Jewish view of resurrection, because
Hmm.
almost everybody who's joining the faith is a Gentile.
I'd be curious if you've done much research on kind of the ancient metaphysics of the soul. Like when we keep saying soul and spirit, but here in the 21st century, that's kind of an ethereal concept. But from my understanding in antiquity, they still thought of it as substance or stuff.
Yeah, that's right.
Is that right?
Yeah, so we do think of it. I don't know. We have fuzzy thoughts about it. Actually, most people never
Yeah.
thought about it because they think that they think your body dies, your soul goes up to heaven, but you're going to recognize your grandmother. I mean,
Right.
what are you
Yeah.
going to recognize exactly?
Yeah.
Like
So there's still some materiality happening there.
there's material and in the ancient world, there were various views of things, but the typical view in the ancient world for people who believed that there was a soul that was separate from the body, in the Greek thinking, unless you were a really radical dualist, what you thought was that the soul is made up, or the spirit was made up of very fine stuff. Like so our body is kind of coarse material, but there's finer stuff. Like the air is not as coarse, and so we can kind of move through the air. And the spirit is more like that. Actually, pneuma can also mean air. I mean, but it's made of stuff. It's just very fine stuff, and so it can escape the coarse thing of the body and still live on as this kind of thing. And a lot of Greeks thought that stuff inside your body actually could replicate the form and shape and appearance of your body,
Hmm.
which is why in a number of Greek texts, when people see the dead, they look just like they were when they were alive.
Hmm.
For them, it really is stuff. It's not. For us, it's like there's no substance to it, but for them, it actually was a substance.
Hmm. Yeah, I remember back when I was teaching at Boston University, whenever I wanted to try to blow my students' minds, I'd be like, what does hagios pneuma mean? If pneuma, when Paul says Holy Spirit, if we think of pneuma as this substance entering you, like what does that mean when he says your body will be transformed in First Corinthians? It really is wild.
Yeah. Because people don't think about it, but actually, when they do think about it, they realize they do think that their spirit's going to have an appearance, and
Hmm.
so okay.
Yeah. So, talking about our sources, I want to try to transition to your upcoming seminars. So you have a live webinar coming up on November 7th at 3:00 p.m. U.S. East Coast time, and the topic is, Did Jesus call himself God? Uh,
Yeah, I think it's actually, did Jesus think he was God, which is a little
okay.
bit trickier than did he call him, but yeah,
Either way.
it comes down to about the same thing. Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, obviously, in the centuries after Jesus, Christians increasingly were viewing him as God. This was at the heart of the Christological debates. Is he fully human? Is he fully God? But from my understanding, your webinar is really going to focus on, first century, on Jesus. Like, what was he saying about himself? Can you just set the scene, what that's going to look like? What sort of sources you're going to be engaging with?
Yeah. Well, it's a very difficult matter to know what Jesus actually said and did, because we have better sources for Jesus than we have for almost anybody else in the ancient world. I mean, it's not like we're like everybody else is well documented and Jesus is not. And we know more about Jesus than about 99.9% of the human race back then. But the sources are still problematic. Outside of the Gospels, we really don't have anything that can help us know the things that Jesus said very much, a little bit. So we're restricted to the four Gospels. And the four Gospels themselves have problems because it's great to have these four accounts of Jesus' life, but they're written decades later by people who didn't know him, in a different language. They're living in a different part of the Mediterranean. And so they're basing what they're writing on stories that they've heard that have been passed down. And there are places where they're at odds with each other. And there are historical discrepancies in the Gospels and various kinds of problems. And so it's hard to know what Jesus really said, but scholars work on it. And there are some very interesting things that come out when you actually approach the Gospels as historical sources rather than documents of faith. And, it's not that it doesn't have to be, that you can do only one or the other. A lot of people do both. They're both documents of faith and documents that can tell you about history. And for this talk, I'm interested in what they tell us about history. What do the Gospels tell us about what Jesus actually said about himself? we're on much better ground knowing what he said about other things, such as what he said about the coming kingdom of God, for example, or the need to repent, or the need to obey God in certain ways. We got pretty good information about that. It's difficult when you say, what did he say about himself, in part because you have very different representations of this in the four Gospels. And in particular, our last Gospel, John, the Gospel of John, has a very different perspective on just this question than our earliest Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke do. And so that's the issue I'm addressing, and it's tied up with the whole question of Jesus' identity. I mean, people later said all sorts of things about him. People today say all sorts of things about Jesus, and which is fine, and people believe all sorts of things about Jesus. But where do these ideas come from? The idea that he's the Messiah, for example, is that something that he said or that he thought? And how would you show it? Or that he was the Son of God, or that he was a pre-incarnate divine being? Did Jesus think that he existed before he was born?
Yeah. So I want to set the cultural stage a little bit. So going back to Enoch and going back to the Dead Sea Scrolls, am I wrong to think that Jesus was swimming in the sort of cultural waters where he had the cultural vocabulary to think of himself as an exalted being? Because Enoch is referred to as, as a human, but also the son of man in the book of Enoch. I believe Melchizedek, who's the mysterious priest king from Genesis, is referred to as an angelic being, at least one or two of the Dead Sea Scrolls. So it strikes me that there may have been cultural vocabulary that a preacher in the first century could have drawn on to think of himself as an exalted being. Maybe not God himself, but as somewhat more than human.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's theoretically possible, sure. The thing is, Enoch himself did not think of himself as God. That's what other people are saying about Enoch.
Right.
And Melchizedek didn't think of himself as God. That's other people talking about Melchizedek. And the question is, are there instances, for example, of Jews in the first century who thought that they were God? That would be an interesting question. So it's a little bit different from saying that First Enoch is portrayed that way, because Jesus is also portrayed that way. And one might ask, is the portrayal of Jesus because you have these other people who are portrayed as God, even though they didn't think that about themselves? And I should stress that whether or not Jesus thought of himself as God has no bearing on the question of whether he was God.
Right, of course. Yeah.
I mean, I don't think I'm a schmuck, but I might be. So,
right.
I'm separating the theological question. I'm not asking, was Jesus God? But, it probably would matter to people if it turns out Jesus did not think he was God. That probably would matter to people theologically, but it doesn't have to matter to people, because I know I have friends who say, look, Jesus never called himself God, but say, oh yeah, he's absolutely is God.
Yeah.
These are smart people. So
yeah, and the analogies I brought up are not necessarily good analogies, because Enoch and Melchizedek are these legendary figures from deep time, while Jesus, we're talking about this very almost just a few decades between his life and then when Paul was writing and when the Gospels were.
Oh yeah, no, I think the followers of Jesus were calling him God just almost right after his death.
Yeah,
just very soon after his death, and so that's a very interesting issue about like how the belief in Jesus developed and changed over time, and where does it start? Does it start in the ministry, or does it start later? And if it starts later, what motivates it? These are really interesting historical questions, and they obviously have very big religious implications. And so, but I treat them as a historical question. I don't say, well, Jesus was God, therefore he must have called himself God. That's not the approach that I would take, because I wouldn't see that as a historical approach. That would be, if I say Jesus was God, that's a religious belief. And so I can't predicate a historical argument on a religious belief.
Right. Yeah, no, that's the same approach I take on the YouTube channel, trying to parse between the confessional approaches and critical approaches. And when it comes to the sources are just so problematic, trying to parse between, what was later ascribed to Jesus and what he might have said himself. This kind of goes into the whole historical Jesus studies field. And by that, we just mean, the man himself versus what did people write about him. I think Paula Fredrickson, the New Testament scholar, has her book titled From Jesus to Christ,
Yeah.
speaking of this
Yeah.
movement from human to, God-like literary figure.
Yeah.
I think it was James Crossley who wrote recently, a New Testament professor, in his blog, that he wants to start a new quest for the search for the historical Jesus, saying that the field has somewhat stagnated in the late 90s and early 2000s. So I'd like to pitch it to you. If you were like put yourself in the mind of a new PhD student that has to come up with a dissertation on, Jesus, the topic of Jesus, the topic of first century Judaism in the Galilee, like what sort of research has there yet to be done that could be pursued in this topic that might go against this idea that the field has stagnated?
Lots of fields stagnate because they kind of have already done the best they could. And so there are lots of areas of mathematics that are not going to change.
Right.
Square root of 9 is always going to be 3, and it's not necessarily the case that it's stagnated. It's just like that. Work that one out. In historical fields and in the humanities, there are always new avenues that open up because of discoveries, for example, and new ways of looking at evidence, new methods that develop. But these you call it a paradigm shift. These paradigm shifts are never predictable, so you can't tell somebody to go do that. Somebody will discover something or come up with something, and it might change the field. But the fact that we've gotten to a point we're not going to do much more doesn't necessarily mean that there's going to be a better way. There have been a lot of people who propose, people who know about the quest of the historical Jesus, they talk about the first quest and the second quest and the third quest. And now people say, oh, look, I'm going to start a fourth quest. Well, okay, you might, but I mean, what are you going to do? And most of the people who object to the methods that are used they simply don't have any better solutions. And so I'm not sure that it's going to move into something that it certainly might move into something that's new. You could argue that, that Jesus actually was a Gentile, or something. You could come up with something,
come up with whatever,
and write a book about it, but it's not going to be probably convincing to most people. So I'm not saying that nothing's going to happen. What I'm saying is that if you have a major shift in an entire discipline that is a paradigm shift, it's not predictable, and you can't generate it by wanting to generate it. What you do is you do the work, and then you have an insight, and you think, oh my God, this changes everything. But you can't go into it saying, okay, I'm going to change everything without any idea what you're doing.
Right.
So I don't know what he has in mind. And so I really don't know. I will say though that the people who have really come out against the traditional methods for establishing historical Jesus, I think that they're completely off base, because the methods that people use for the historical Jesus, you and I know, I don't know if all the people listening to this will know, but there are these various criteria that people use for multiple
criteria,
embarrassment, dissimilarity, and it's very easy to trash those. It really is. It's not easy to come up with something else. And the problem is that those methods are the methods that historians all use for everything. They just don't call them that. But this is how history is done. If you want to know about somebody in the past, you look at the sources carefully, you see how trustworthy they are, you evaluate them, you compare them, and you see if there are multiple sources that say the same thing independently say something about someone or not. And you see whether there's somebody's personal interest involved in this, whether they might be slanted one way or another or not. You see whether it fits into their historical context, we know about otherwise or not. It's just what history does. And so if we're going to change how we do the quest of the historical Jesus, unless you change how history's done, I don't know how you're going to do it. So maybe somebody will come up with something. Then a time machine. I don't know.
Yeah. Well, we're coming up against our time, Dr. Ehrman. I just want to thank you again for joining us here. I just want to do one more pitch for those of you that are interested in joining Dr. Ehrman's upcoming webinar on Jesus and the question of whether or not people called him God during his own lifetime. It's on November 7th at 3:00 p.m. U.S. East Coast time. You can find a link to join this webinar in the description below. And again, Dr. Ehrman, thanks for joining us.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.